So I'm just going to open up with a few remarks, and then I will introduce each of the speakers in kind, and they'll give a brief overview of points that they've come up themselves. And then after that, we'll open it up to everyone to have questions, comments, and here we go. So in December of 2010, a man named Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in the streets of Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia. The young man, who later died from his burns, was protesting the confiscation of his fruits and vegetables by police. This symbolic act of sacrificial resistance to an overreaching dictatorship sparked a season of uprising dubbed the Arab Spring. Now, more than a year after Tunisian dictator Ben Ali's resignation and subsequent flight from the country he had ruled for more than 23 years, the Arab Spring continues to reshape the political landscape of the middle of the world. In the island kingdom of Bahrain, demonstrations led by the Shiite majority seek to loosen the grip of power exercised by the Sunni monarchy. The Pearl Roundabout, the site of major protests a year ago, has been demolished by the Bahraini government and declared a military restricted zone. The Pearl Monument, which is at the center of the roundabout, has been torn down and removed from the face of Bahrain's most valuable coin. In Kuwait, protests and corruption charges forced the emir to dissolve parliament and arrange for another election. This election, which took place just last week, resulted in a huge turnover. A new Islamist-led majority seeks to establish trust with Kuwaitis who are frustrated with a lack of transparency in their government. Liberal groups, however, now fear a move towards Saudi-style Sharia law is inevitable. In Saudi Arabia, protests against the Saud royal family's rule continue, despite a pattern of uprising leadership being killed by their government. Many of the protests have taken a feminist tone, as repressed Saudi women push for suffrage, the freedom to drive cars, and other rights denied to them. This prompted King Abdullah to announce that women will be allowed to vote in the municipal elections of 2015. In Morocco, King Mohammed VI has bent to pressures from rioters and granted more power to political parties and to the parliament. Protests continue in the North African country, where unemployment for those under the age of 34 sits at over 30%. Just last month, a group of 5 men self-immolated, protesting a lack of jobs and access to food. In Algeria, President Bouteflika has amended the constitution, or had amended the constitution, to allow himself to run for office indefinitely back in 2009. Bending to protests that raged over this and a lack of housing, jobs, and infrastructure, he ended the 19-year-long state of emergency that had illegalized protest gatherings, and he promised constitutional amendments to allow for more representative democracy. In Yemen, there will be an election 2 weeks from now to replace Ali Abdullah Saleh, a dictator for 33 years. Under pressure from opposition for military crackdowns of protests that resulted in hundreds of deaths, Saleh resigned from office and is now in New York getting medical treatment. Yemen is a fracturing nation, dividing along the border of north and south, as well as between Sunni and Shiite. The presence of al-Qaeda further complicates the stability of the country, and violence continues to threaten the validity of the elections. The political turmoil of these nations, to say nothing of the humanitarian crisis in Syria, and the struggle to form legitimate democracies in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, illustrates that the Arab Spring is a season still very much in full swing. So the question we look to explore tonight is, what does it mean for this region of the world, and where is it all headed? So the first of our 2 speakers tonight is Mr. Aziz Abu Sara. He is the co-director for Mason Center for World Religions, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution. He was recently named a National Geographic Emerging Explorer for 2011. He's a lecturer and has spoken in hundreds of churches, synagogues, and mosques on the subject of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, peace, reconciliation, and interfaith dialogue. He has also lectured and facilitated meetings for countless international organizations and universities, including Georgetown, Columbia, Princeton, Brandeis, Yale, and George Washington. And he has also spoken before the European Parliament and the United Nations. Mr. Abu Sarah is a columnist for the Al-Quds newspaper and has published articles in the New York Times, Hearts, and, sorry if I mispronounced Hearts, okay. Jerusalem Post, you guys will pronounce this one for me too, Al-Arabiya, okay. Daily Star and the Middle East Online and others. He regularly provides analysis for television news programs. Mr. Abu Sarah co-hosted a radio show in Jerusalem for 3 years with tens of thousands of listeners from around the world, including the United States, and is a regular contributor for 972mag.com, a new Israeli online English magazine. He joined Mason Center for World Religions, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution in 2009 as Director of Middle East Projects. At CDRC, Mr. Abu Sarah builds connections between Jewish and Arab Americans and organizes CDRC's overseas education seminars that bring students from Mason and several other universities to the Middle East and other regions around the world. The seminars educate the participants in narratives that equally represent each side of a historical conflict. So go ahead, Aziz.
Thank you. Thank you. I didn't actually know I was gonna have to prepare remarks, so I didn't prepare anything, but that'll be fun. So you'll hear what I really think instead of what. Can everybody hear me? It's working. Yeah. So you'll hear really what I think instead of my prepared remarks, which is, I guess, good. Looking at the Arab Spring at the moment, I think many people looking at the developments of what's happening might have lost certain hope about where it's going. There was a lot more enthusiasm when it first started. There was a lot more hope, a lot more people feeling energized by it. And I remember talking to people when the Tunisian revolution started, when the Egyptian revolution started, and there was something going on. But after a year of it, you see a little bit of a decline of that enthusiasm by many, many people looking at what's happening in Syria, especially what's happening even in Yemen, despite that Saleh is not going to be running for the next election, still that the possibilities of that place is not looking good, and a lot of tribal infights and so on. Looking at Egypt and the developments that have been happening there made a lot of people lose certain hope of what's happening. I'm not losing hope because I think what we see at the moment is something that's expected. Normally after a revolution, people think it's gonna end very soon, it's gonna be all very exciting and very great, and democracy is gonna come and no other problems will ever existed. It'll stop raining when you're out and without an umbrella, and, miracles. And that's not the way revolutions happen. If you look at every other revolution before the Egyptian and the Tunisian and so on, you will see that there's a pattern of those revolutions that is being recreated here. A pattern of one that when a revolution happens, you have either a dictator that comes up after it, which is often the case. Even in the Egyptian side, the last revolution they had in the 50s was a revolution by military, a coup that led to a Nasser rule, and then after that everybody was a military leader, Sadat and Mubarak. If you look at other revolutions as well, you'll see a pattern of a revolution that will have to have 2 or 3 revolutions before stability happens. And that takes somewhere between 2 to 5 to even 10 years until stability would happen. So looking at what's going on in Egypt or what's going on in Tunisia, what's going on in other places is no surprise. In many ways, it is something to be expected, and it will take time before democracy or a new rule is happening. And especially when we look at the Egyptian, I think, and Tunisian revolution, it's inspiring to me because there was no one figurehead that was leading those revolutions. And that's a good thing, because often when there is one dynamic, charismatic leader that leads those revolutions, you end up most likely with a dictator. When you don't have that, you end up with frictions and different groups that will fight among themselves to take over government. And that's much better, actually, in creating plurality in those countries. When I look at the Arab revolutions, when we look at the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening, as prefer to call it, as we already not in the spring anymore. It's been a year. You look at multiple reasons of why it started, and that's, I think, one mistake often people, when they look at Egypt, when they look at Tunisia, they think it's the same reasons. Bahrain, Yemen, Palestine, there are ones that are less known. Jordan, that still there is some unrest in them. And they look at them and think, you know, we brush the whole Arab world as together. Well, the reason is corruption, the reason is problems with governments, dictatorship, and so on. But that's not necessarily true about every place. That's not necessarily really the true motivation for every one of those. And every case in some needs to be studied separately from the others. So although there are some common denominators among them, you can't say they all have the exact same reasons. By the way, how long do I have?
You got another good 5-6 minutes.
Okay, good. Otherwise, I keep going on and boring you for a long time. But the common dominators might have to do with, yes, corruption is important. But if you look at corruption in Tunisia, in Egypt, in some of those countries, yeah, they scored very low in the corruption index. But if you look at Bahrain, for example, which had its own revolution, Bahrain scored very good compared to all the other Arab countries when it comes to corruption. So the issue of corruption was not the real reasoning behind the unrest and the protests that happened in Bahrain. The issue of corruption was probably one of the least in those. Bahrain had a problem with the Sunni and Shiites, with the minority ruling a majority in the country, where actually a majority of people living in Bahrain don't have citizenship in it because they are not from there. So you have to look at each one of those very separately. Now, some of the common dominators are very important as well, specifically mentioned earlier, the youth that played very important role in the Arab world. In most Arab countries, 70%, sometimes a little less, but 70% more or less of the population under 35 years old. That tells you that the majority of people are young in those countries. Now, when then you look at unemployment and you look at opportunities that these youth have, they are very, very limited, especially in work. So in places like Egypt and places like Tunisia, you had a very well-educated youth, but you had no opportunities for them after they finished college. My family is part Palestinian, part Egyptian. I grew up in Jerusalem, but my family that's in Egypt, my nephew, for example, who studied computers and finished his degree, and 3 years after he finished his degree, he still couldn't find a job in the field he studied, or any field. He actually had to work in a pizza place to be able to make a living, until he got a contract to go and work in Saudi. And that is not just his story, that's the story of many, many Egyptians. Now, he was lucky to get, is viewed as very, very, very lucky to be able to get a contract to go and work in Saudi Arabia, but the majority of the youth there do not have that opportunity. And so the reality of these frustrated people who are educated, who went to college, but can't find a job, these are the ones who led that revolution. And often, especially now when you look backward, as the Islamic parties winning in elections, people forget that actually the revolution wasn't started by the Islamic parties at all. In Egypt specifically, the Islamic groups avoided being part of the protests in the first few days because they didn't want to do it. They didn't want to be part of it. It was started and led by the youth who were frustrated by the regimes. In many of those Arab countries as well, there was some kind of unspoken agreement between the government and between the middle class, which is, we will limit your freedom, but at the same time we will give you a bit of a comfortable life. We will allow a middle class community to exist. And that continued until the last few years, where the level of life for middle class families started declining faster and faster. And that's where people found themselves with no middle class life level, and at the same time no freedom. And so they kept their part of the bargain of not rebelling against the government, but the government wasn't able to keep their part of the bargain, and partly is because of excessive corruption in those governments, and partly because of global issues that, for example, in Egypt, the price of bread doubled. That made reality for the government very hard, and that was increasing also for those governments. So I'll just end with asking, so what's now? And as I started earlier saying, it's not a 1-2 years thing. It's not going to end very soon. I think we end to watch a lot of other countries also joining. Places that are not dealing with the signs that sparked revolutions in other Arab countries. For example, in Jordan, where continuously, almost every other week, there are protests going on. Jordan has its own unique situation, especially in divided communities between the Palestinian background community and the Jordanian Bedouin communities that have a lot of infights among themselves. So you will have to deal with these realities, and if those countries do not deal with those realities, they are doomed to be the next location of a revolution. Places like Egypt and Tunisia that went through a revolution, it will go through turbulences. You'll have different regimes, most likely often by the way, the first constitution being written might not survive, and you might have to go through quite a few revisions, or like in the States, you add a new bills of rights and so on to make sure that all people are equal, not just by words, but actually by law. And so it will have to go through those revisions in those countries. And then in places like Syria and like that still have violence, and like Yemen, I think it's going to be, the way it's going to go, it's going to depend on how much the international community going to be involved or not. I think Syria is a very sad example because compared to Libya, Syria is a very forgotten place. It's not really as much on the agenda of the international community, and there's hundreds of people being massacred week after week. Very little is really done to end the massacres there. However, I do not think necessarily, I don't mean by saying that an intervention by sending the NATO military there is a way. I think I see Syria more as a place that the Arab countries and Turkey specifically need to have more intervention in, not necessarily the international community as a whole, with the support of the international community. But with that, we have to also remember that there are interests in the region with other political powers, and here the US has its own allies in the region, and Russia and China have their own allies in the region, and Syria and Iran are the last allies that China and Russia have in the Middle East, and they're not likely to give them up very easily. They do want to keep a foothold in the Middle East, and so it's normal for them to oppose any intervention that would take away their allies, and we need to figure out a way to deal with that, and that's where conflict resolution, I guess, comes into play. So, thank you.
All right, thank you. Our second speaker is Mr. Mustafa Haji. He's a Moroccan national, and he holds a bachelor's degree in law from Moulay Ismail University in Meknes, and a master's degree in global affairs from George Mason. And additionally, he is currently enrolled in the Global Trade Management Certificate Program here at GMU in the School of Public Policy. And since he moved to the United States in 2007, he's been engaged in a number of academic and professional endeavors pertaining to the Middle East and North Africa. He worked at the Iraqi Memory Foundation in DC and served as a research assistant to Dr. Dina Khoury, associate professor at George Washington University, in her project on Iraq. Her book, The Outcome of This Research, will be published later this year. Mr. Haji has also conducted extensive research on human trafficking in the MENA region, particularly in Morocco. Currently, he works at the Saudi Embassy's cultural mission. So, go ahead, Mustafa.
Thank you for the generous introduction. How this works, by the way? Yeah, please help me with this technical stuff.
Yeah, if you pull it up.
Oh, this is much more complicated
Yeah.
than mine.
Yours is easy. Thank you for the generous introduction. Can you hear me? Thank you for the generous introduction. Tonight we will be talking to you about...
Sorry, if you just want to pull it a little bit closer, I think we'll hear you a little bit better.
Now?
There we go.
Tonight we'll be talking to you about the Moroccan version of the Arab Spring. I won't be talking about Syria, I won't be talking about Jordan, but I will give you the perspective, my perspective on the Arab Spring through the Moroccan perspective. As you all know, the recent popular uprisings changed the political landscape in the MENA region. Those who were in power are either in exile or in jail or dead. Example, Gaddafi. And the Islamists are more than ever close to becoming the predominant political power in the region. It is a big question, why? We'll get back to this question later on in the discussion. Most countries in the Arab world have identical social problems, political and social problems. Their populations suffer from and face the same challenges: poverty, unemployment, lack of opportunities, corrupt and failing institutions. However, why the Arab Spring manifested itself differently in each of these countries? I think the context, the way governments responded to protesters' demands, the form and speed of this response, the degree of openness of the system, and the leeway of action it offers, without any doubt, shaped the outcome. In Morocco, for instance, the month of February marked the birth of the February 20 movement. It's a youth movement calling, among other things, for democratic institutions, parliamentary monarchy, more openness, the rule of law, social justice. This movement organized its Sunday ritual of protest. The movement organized protest only on Sundays, so not during the weekdays, only on Sundays. So in most Moroccan cities, and these protests went without any major clashes with the police. We see here that the government let them do what they want, let them go and protest. Even though in Moroccan law you cannot protest unless you have a permit from the government. So in this case, they didn't get any permit, they went just spontaneously to protest in the streets. So they give them leeway to express themselves. 2 weeks later, on March 9, 2011, the king, the major and only, in my opinion, the major and only political player in the country, gave a speech in which he promised a new constitution, mirroring people's aspirations. In July 1st of the same year, a constitutional referendum was held, and the majority of Moroccans voted yes for this new constitution. It's the sixth constitution since 1962. On November 25th, parliamentary elections were held, and around 44% of Moroccans casted their votes. You see, only 44%, which means 56% did not even bother to go to cast their votes. Because, I don't know, I see it from a Moroccan perspective, because we grew up in a monarchy, knowing that one day his son will come and take over. People, they don't see that going to vote will bring any change. But anyway, this time, the Party of Justice and Development, which is the equivalent of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, took the lead with 106 seats. Now this party with an Islamic affinity. Let me here clarify. In Morocco, you cannot start a political party based on religion or ethnicity or any discriminatory character. So here they say that they believe that Islam should be included in managing state and extra, but they cannot. If I'm not a Muslim and I want to go and be a member, if I fit the requirements, I can become a member of the party. So 4 days later, the king appointed Mr. Abdelilah bin Kiran, who is the head of this party, as prime minister. As you can see, in less than 10 months, Morocco changed its constitution, elected a new parliament, and formed a new government. We see here the speed. One would ask why the monarch chose to give up some of his prerogatives and the powers without much resistance. I think that by making some concessions, the monarch took the momentum away from the February 20 movement and prevented it from gaining more support from the different clusters of society. It seems also that the monarchy sped up the process of shifting, of change, to shift and divert the pressure that the protesters exerted on it towards a third party, in this case the government. Because a real, an in-depth analysis and a careful read of the constitution, this one or previous constitutions, will reveal that the government does not have much power. In reality, it is a kind of a facade, taking the heat when things go wrong, and instead of the real actor, political actor in charge, who is the king, who has arms in the three branches of the government. He can do whatever, because in Morocco we have a government council and the ministers' council, which is presided by the monarch himself, and this ministers' council is the one enacting laws and signing, and the government cannot do anything unless they have the approval from the king. Please also note that the movement, the youth movement, February 20, triggered the process of change, but did not shape the outcome. They protested, they pressured the government, but they did not participate in shaping the outcome. They were not, for instance, included in the discussions leading to the new constitution. I think this is due to many factors, including its fragmentation, lack of a clear and well-defined objective. This movement were like, we need the king to be like the King of Britain, but it's different history, different context. King is not going to give up all his privileges in one day. Yeah, let's be like the King of Britain. So also they had like poor organization and a lack of support from the Moroccan elites and intellectuals. Moroccan elites did not support this group. They did not. Moroccan intellectuals too did not support this group. And also there's this problem. Moroccan intellectuals or elites, when they come to speak on TV about an issue, they speak, for instance, or some of them, the majority I can say, they speak in French. And the majority of Moroccans there, we have around 48 to 50% of illiterate people. They don't know even how to write their names, and somebody speaking to them in French, they are not going to believe this guy because they don't understand him, or they think that this person is snubbing us, speaking to us in four languages, the language of la crème de la société, so to speak. So, and also, this group did not have a charismatic leadership. We didn't know who is in charge. This movement also was an umbrella for a number of groups with contradictory ideologies. For instance, you find Islamists and leftists and atheists in the same group. For sure, the honeymoon would last forever. So, as you can see here, Morocco had a mild version of the Arab Spring that engendered some positive change, which is seen by some as the first step toward a democracy. This is what I have to say about Morocco. Please feel free to ask questions. And also, I want to leave the discussion open by asking the following questions. What is behind the rise of Islamists in the Arab world? Why we see now Islamists are everywhere? They won elections in Morocco, they won elections in Egypt, they won elections in Tunisia, they won elections in Kuwait. Why is this? What about Algeria? I don't think any major events happen in Algeria. Why? We see the same context, the same problems, but we don't see the same outcome. And another question: do monarchies whether pressure better than republics? And what is the impact of the Arab Spring on peace in the Middle East? Thank
All
you.
right, thank you. Thank you to both of our panelists. So now we're going to open up for questions from all of you. So if you have one or a comment, please just raise your hand and there's a microphone that will be coming around. I think we have the first question right here up front. This gentleman here.
What role is social media playing?
Thank you.
I think social media was very important because before, still the government controls, the traditional channels of information, TV and radio stations and all that. So social media was like an alternative for people to discover the information or to verify the information. Before, my dad, who is illiterate, he used to tell me, they said this in TV. It's like a Bible or Quran or something. It was said in TV, that's it. Now social media and, lowers the cost of spreading the information. It's like a friend of yours posts something on Facebook, you share it with your friend and it's spread. Like, it's also speed. It gives you speed of circulating information. And it was like played a major role because it was like a virtual place where all the activists managed to share ideas or managed to schedule events and protests. It played a major role in Morocco. This group, February 20th Movement, they have a Facebook page, and if you are sympathizer of this group, you go and just hit like, and you become like a kind of a member, and you go out and protest.
It's important though to differentiate between tools and between the causes. And after the revolution in Tunisia started, and then eventually in Egypt, quite a lot of people start crediting Twitter for the revolution, which I think is kind of funny. The founder of Twitter started the revolution in Egypt. And yes, Twitter and Facebook and so on are very, very important tools, but they're not the cause of this revolution. It would have happened with or without. It would have been harder, would have been more complicated, but still would have happened with or without Facebook and Twitter.
It's also interesting to note the different reactions from the regimes to social media. Like in Iran, we saw that they completely shut down access to social media.
Egypt too.
And Egypt as well. In Morocco, I think it was just last week, there was a young man, I think he was 19, that he was arrested for posting a picture of the king in some awkward position. And once he was arrested, there were a whole bunch of other Facebook posts of the similar pictures of people protesting this young man being arrested for posting on Facebook. So, any other questions? You have to have more. Got one in the back.
Sure. My question is actually about Iran and the impact of these changes in the region, how that'll impact Iran, especially with upcoming potential government changes. And what do you see about Iran's role in reshaping some of these new governments?
This is you, me. I'm not an expert on Iran, so.
Comes to Iran, I think the revolution is in the Arab world did inspire things in Iran. There are things moving in the grassroots level, but there are other things I think in Iran can't be ignored now, especially the threat of being attacked from outsiders. And the reality is, regardless of how much you disagree with your government, the moment you're attacked by an outsider, whether it's going to be Israel or the United States or whichever, then you don't see yourself as enemies anymore. Actually, if you go back to the 80s when Khomeini took over, Khomeini would never have been able to crush the opposition like he did after the Iran-Iraq war started. And I think that's where they are now, where the government in Iran and Khomeini are able to bring everybody together by saying, look, Israel's going to strike us in the next few months. We can't be divided now. It is the outsiders. And this is, by the way, what other Arab regimes have tried to do. Just with Iran, it's much easier because there are talks about striking Iran every day. But Egypt tried to do the same. Syria is still saying it's all a Zionist conspiracy, what's happening there. In Egypt, it's still until now, actually, whenever something happens, always outsiders who are in charge of it. But with Iran, I don't see any change happening soon, especially with outsiders saying we're going to attack the country.
We have a question up here.
I think the microphone will be easier. Thank you. I mean, this is just a bit of perspective, but in 1989, we witnessed a series of events that took place in Eurasia and which ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this was a result of revolutionary acts. So my question is, would you say the events of 1989 are somehow analogous to what's going on right now? And what are the big differences? Of course, I understand that there's a cultural context that needs to be considered, but in your opinion, what would you say the great differences are between the two eras?
Personally, I think there is a huge difference between the two eras. Before, the ex-URSS was weak at the time, and once because it was controlling the whole region. Once the country that was controlling that region, it became weak and shrinking. Other people were aspiring for freedom and calling for freedom and pressuring their own governments for change. And also they were helped somehow from the West in general. In our case, in the Arab world, in the MENA region, it's different. It's like people bringing about change by themselves, go in and protesting. They don't have an army. They just, I'm going to protest. Maybe I will be killed, maybe not. But even though they hear that, let me give you this personal story. I'm from a village in Morocco, and when I had to go to the middle school, I had to go to a boarding school. The first advice that my mom gave me and my dad gave me is do not participate in any protests. I swear to God, that's the first advice. Do not, even if they give you bad food or it is, just eat it and be quiet. Even family conditions people to become submissive to regimes. But once people saw what Bouazizi did, she said, if I can I'm looking for a job, but I can find it. I'm trying to sell vegetables, and they are not letting me sell vegetables. What can I do? Let me burn myself. I'm dead. If I'm not, I can do many stuff that we take here for granted. Somebody somewhere else cannot, do that. So let me kill myself. And he killed himself, and he inspired, what's happening right now in
We have another question back here.
Hey, I have a question. So you mentioned about the time it would take for a lot of these countries to become stable, given where they are. How do you reconcile that patience factor with the fact that you still have such a young population, where unemployment is still an issue, and some of the cases, some of these industries might have already been destroyed through the revolutionary process.
Can't hear you.
And say some of these industries where employment was even possible might have been destroyed or at a stall. How do you reconcile that patience factor with a 70% under 35 population looking for opportunity?
There is no patience factor in many ways. I look at it as an analyst and say, I know that it's not gonna get stable for a few years. Now, this is not the perspective of the people there. One of the biggest problems of revolution is you want things to happen right away. And as I was very excited for the revolution in Egypt and in Libya and in Tunisia and all of that, but at the same time, I understand that, and I prefer reform instead of revolution. I prefer that what Mustafa here talked about and the changes happening in Morocco, even if they're much slower, because regardless of how slower they are, they might be faster eventually in the long term in making a real change than a revolution. That's not always what people gonna feel, and so they're not gonna look at it. I look at it here as an outsider. They're not looking at it as an outsider. They're looking at it from a personal perspective. We can't have jobs, we can't do this. And the Arab leaders were very problematic in the way they responded to it. They didn't respond to it like Morocco did, or even Jordan did, and being very careful not using violence. Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, Yemen, all these countries believed, Syria now, that if you crush the revolution, it's gonna work out. And one after one kept doing the same mistake, which is if little violence is not working, then more violence is gonna work. And what happens a week later, you see one of them get on TV, and it almost was identical, by the way. I mean, you think they're gonna learn, and I'm surprised they stayed in power as long as they did, because they're really not that smart. I mean, okay, in Tunisia, okay, it made sense. Ben Ali was the first one, we can give him a pass. He comes out on TV a week later, a few days later, and says, okay, I'm gonna give up a little of my power. And what they did always is give too little, too late. And if they've done it from the beginning and came and said, okay, we recognize you have some demands and we're gonna give those demands, I don't think it would have got to the way it did. And until it gets too late for them, that's when normally they come out and say, okay, we're going to give you a little bit more. So, and Mubarak went on and did the same thing. And Assad, while this was going on, he got on TV and bragged about how Syria is so different than all the other Arab countries. He actually was interviewed by Foreign Policy and said, Syria, I've been doing reform for 2 years. It's so far different now. I know it's not because CRDC runs classes in Syria, our office, so we know it's not that different. And so we weren't surprised to see revolution starting there.
Yeah, another one back there.
Good evening. Thank you for enriching our understanding of the Arab Spring and the situation on the ground. When I look up upon the Arab Spring, I feel it's more than an idea of the majority seeking economic justice and jobs and everything. I think it's more kind of the idea of shifting powers. My question more is about, do you believe that the Arab Spring is strong enough to affect the structure of the Islamic groups? Meaning that, do you think that a revolution can happen inside the structure of the Islamic groups, where the youth in these groups are seeking more role in the decision-making process and decision-taking in the future? Thank you.
Here's another question: why the Islamic groups are strong? That's what would kind of answer your question. I think the Islamist group are strong, or because they have credibility. They have never been in power. They have never been tested. They deliver. You find like associations and small organizations in slums, helping people. So people they voted for them as an alternative, and also to show that we don't want to go back to the same people. Let's try these people. It's because they have never been tested. And I think the Islamists now in Morocco or in Tunisia or elsewhere, if they don't deliver, they will lose their credibility. They are forced. Before we used to hear of the supreme leader or something. Now we hear of the Secretary General of this political party. They started adopting democratic tools and electing even their leaders. So they are learning. They have to adapt. In Morocco, for instance, this Islamic party did not come and form the government by itself, but they had to build a coalition with what? With whom? With leftists. You see now Islamists with a leftist working together to solve the real problems, because if they don't deliver, that will be messy and they will create more problems, and maybe next day we'll see Moroccans, they will say, we don't want this government and we don't want a king. And you'll see kind of a turmoil in Morocco. So they have to deliver in economic issues and social issues and also in governance. They have to innovate. Otherwise, if they don't adapt, next time people they won't vote for them. What they want, people right now, they want results. They don't care who will be in power. They want results. If somebody cannot find, food to feed his kids, he's not going to. Is he an Islamist with a beard or without a beard? No, they care about results. That's what matters most of this time.
I agree, and I think you have to look also at a little bit of the history of some of these countries where the Islamic groups are getting stronger. One, Islamic groups were the only groups that were somewhat organized when these protests started. And the reason is, when you're not allowed to protest anywhere, you're not allowed to gather politically anywhere, guess where's the only place you're going to do it? Is the mosque. That's the only place where people actually gather for something, and that's where you start organizing. So it's no surprise that they had some structure already. In Egypt, the Islamic Brotherhood were the only group that had some structure already. The rest of the parties were more or less a joke. They didn't exist in reality, whether it's Kifaya and Ayman Noor and all these groups. On paper they existed, but they didn't have a structure. They didn't have really foot soldiers. They had nobody to spread their ideology. So that's one. The second, I think what you mentioned is really important, is when you're not tested, you're great. And being religious gives them some kind of credibility against corruption. Everybody in the government before, whether again Egypt or Tunisia or so on, were seculars. And it gave kind of the idea that seculars are corrupt, and so maybe religious people who have more values in this case, people viewed them in this in this way, that maybe religious people have more values and maybe they won't be as corrupt as the rest of the government. What's interesting today, for example, in Egypt, is seeing the shift getting to the point where actually the Islamic Brotherhood last week called on the U.S. to keep its involvement in Egypt and not to give up and not to withdraw from Egypt, which is something very bizarre because normally you would hear the opposite just a year or two ago. So there is, I think, a transformation within these Islamic groups, and I think they have the right to participate politically. I think just because they have religious identity, that doesn't mean they have no right to participate politically. And I think we, even in the States, I mean, you have groups that have very strong Christian identity. If you watch the presidential debate at the moment in the Republican Party, it's all about Christianity. It's all about we are a Christian nation. Nobody says Gingrich not supposed to run because, or Santorum, because they think the rest of us who are not Christian, whatever, even if you're Christian not according to their own way, do not deserve to be in office. So we have to look at that and say democracy is about allowing people who you disagree with to be in government as well. And I think it's good for the Muslims to govern and not just to be in opposition and say everybody is wrong. And then hopefully you'll see a lot more changes.
All right, we had some more questions up front too next time.
I had a quick question about Syria. Not to undermine Tunisia and Egypt's revolutions, but I think Syria has a very big, is a big player in that region. So what are your expectations if Assad's regime does in fact fall? What do you see happening to groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and then also minority groups like the Christian groups in Syria and Lebanon?
Hamas is smarter than everybody else, I think, because they already left Syria. Hamas ended all its ties in Syria, and that's in predicting that maybe it's not going to get a lot of support anymore from Syria. So they did a preemptive attack idea. So Hezbollah and all these groups would suffer a lot, especially with Syria. Syria is the main place where they get their weapons from. It's the main place where they get financial support from, or from Iran through Syria. So yes, it will affect them a lot, and that will affect the whole Middle Eastern power structure. For Hamas, it'll be different because now they get, again, their power more going to be through Egypt, not through actually Syria. Because Gaza is bordering Egypt, the government now in Egypt is less hostile toward Hamas. So, but the whole region is a changing already, and I think as people become more involved in governing, that's in itself, whether it's in Egypt or Syria or so on, that's going to make a difference in the political map and the whole Middle East conflict with Israel and the Arab conflict. As for the groups within Syria, one of the things that's interesting about Syria, different about Egypt and Tunisia, is it's not a one minority. You talked about the Christians, but Syria is made out of few minorities. You have also the Kurds, you have also the Alawites, you have also the Druze, you have such a mix of minorities. And that makes Syria a dangerous place. That's where, as I'm supporting the opposition, I'm very worried about how it's going to end, because even now the opposition is very fragmented, and unless they can come to some kind of unity, it could be a mess. It could be really bad, and it could take a while until things get a little bit more structure. And I hope the opposition will get to more agreements before the Syrian regime falls, because if they don't, it's not going to be, the instability will be very bad.
Thank you very much for the talks. My question is related to the peace between Israelis and Palestinians. What, according to you, what is going to happen? Is the Arab uprising going to affect that conflict? Is it going to attenuate it or exacerbate it? Thank you.
It's already affecting it, I think, in very important ways. Well, one, interestingly, when the uprising in Syria started, every analyst I knew in Israel was saying that the Israeli government wanted Assad to stay in place because there was so much change that they wanted some stability somewhere. And even though the Assad regime is being viewed anti-Israel and supporting Hamas and Hezbollah, they actually wanted Assad to stay in power. But one of the changes that's very important for Palestinians is the Egyptian change. Mubarak was not very much, although you often hear the Arabs support Palestine and the Americans support, I guess, Israel. That's not really the way it was. And if you look at some of the leaked papers, it's called, what was it, the Palestine Papers, you will see that Egypt often in negotiations supported, or Mubarak in negotiations supported Israel in many, many times and was against the Palestinian view. Actually, also when Palestinians were fundraising, there are quotes from him about saying, stop giving Palestinians money and then they will agree to whatever Israel is willing to give them. So the change is going to pressure Israel and make things a lot more complicated in the sense that they lost the biggest ally for them in Egypt. Jordan now is very concerned that the two-state solution is not functionable anymore, and if that's a reality, you hear voices in Israel calling for Jordan to become the Palestinian state instead of the West Bank, and so Jordan is very concerned and been acting much more. The last negotiation rounds were in Jordan, so that's making a difference. But I think Israelis in general gonna feel that it's not anymore making deals just with dictators. You can't win the Arab world without ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And if you want to become natural part of the Middle East, you have to deal with the reality that you're occupying 3.5 million Palestinians, and you have to end that, regardless of what solution it is. And we can argue about the actual solution, but that must end, or Israel going to feel much more unfriendly neighbors around it, and you already can see it with the gas pipe between Egypt and Israel, which for the 8th time I think it was bombed just last week. So that tells you that there is more movement within those neighboring Arab countries, and if Syria, the regime falls, that's another place where Israel is going to feel more pressure as people get more to rule.
Very good discussion, both of you. Maybe building on that last set of comments, Aziz, for both of you, discuss the dynamics of the Sunni-Shia rivalry and how that ricochets through this new landscape. You mentioned, Aziz, that the Islamists were best prepared as this unfolded. Mustafa, you're saying that it's how the expectations of the people are going to be met, actually, physically, that really matters. Are there differences in how the Shia and the Sunni are playing this set of uprisings? Are there going to be future conflicts between Sunni and Shia? 2 case studies, one Bahrain, where you had working class Shia against ruling class Sunni, and that was put down. And then the other case study is larger between countries, between, say, Iran Shia and Saudi Arabia Sunni. That rivalry could go on for quite some time.
Let me go first here. You know, before the war in Iraq in 2003, I never knew what was the difference between a Sunni and a Shia. I'm Muslim, but I never knew. Because I live in Morocco, you know, everybody Muslim. I know I have some Jews, some Christians, but I never made the distinction between Sunni and Shia. So honestly, for me, it was like, how can, for instance, you know, somebody who is a Muslim can kill another Muslim because they of some minor difference. We believe in the same books, but there's some minor difference, political problems, or who is entitled to be in power. So I think in Bahrain, people, I think in 72 or 3, they held like elections there, referendum, because they were either to be independent or to go with Iran, but they choose to be independent. It shows as people that have more a national identity as Arabs to be independent from a Persian, you know, country. So here we see that the national identity prevailed over the religious identity, so to speak. So I think this rivalry, I think, is like, does not have really basis. It's like exacerbated by the governments, in my own opinion. Because if we had democracy in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in different Arab countries, everybody will have venues to express themselves and protect their rights, protect their freedoms, because the system will encompass everybody and give them like rights to exercise their religions. An example here in the States, because it's a free country, you can be a Mormon, you can be a Mennonite, you can be a Baha'i, you can be a Sunni, you can be a Shia, you can build a mosque there, you can build something there. So freedom gives people, attenuates the tensions that
Mechanisms
exist.
of adjustment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in society. That's my own analysis.
I had a different experience growing up. I was telling him earlier that we have to find a place where we disagree so we can have a fight. It's just to entertain you, that's all. Not that big of a disagreement though. There's a very good TV show in Al Jazeera in Arabic, and normally they bring two people who hate each other and they make them argue, and often it ends with them throwing the bottles at each other, and it's a very entertaining show. Not gonna do it, don't worry. So, my experience is very different. I grew up in a Sunni family also, and I grew up with in the 80s with the Iraq-Iran war, and I was told that we the Muslims and they the infidels. That's my experience growing up, and I remember watching films about the war and thinking, well, I'm with the Iraqis against the Iranians, which is kind of ridiculous because Iraq has quite a lot of Shiites as a majority. So there is a lot of tension between the two sides, and it showed the hypocrisy in some ways within the Arab world when the Bahrain Revolution protests started, because the same people who were speaking so much for Egypt, speaking for Tunisia, speaking for all the other Arab countries to yes, and we for democracy and we need to change, when it came to Bahrain, many of those same voices, I'll name just one, Qaradawi for example, said no, but Bahrain is very different, it's Iran, it's not about the human rights and democracy and so on. Yeah, that is possibly true. There is definitely some Iranian influence, but the reason there is Iranian influence is because people there are not feeling part of the country. It's because people there are oppressed. It's because people there do not have the same equal rights. It's because half of the people in the government are relatives of the king. So sure, they're gonna look somewhere else, and they found that somewhere else in Iran. So instead of saying the protest is motivated by Iran, you have to look and say why they protesting, what we doing wrong they're protesting. And people weren't as interested in the Arab world, I think, in many ways, and maybe my part of the Arab world, we divided it, the Northern Africa and the Middle East. They weren't, because it's a Shia thing and maybe Iran then gonna take over, and that's when Saudis and the Gulf countries sent military to Bahrain to crush the protests there. When it comes to Saudi and Iran, it's also what's normally said in the Middle East is that it's not, everybody talks about Iran wanting to strike, about Israel wanting to strike Iran. What we less hear about is quite a few Gulf countries are not opposed to that as well, including Saudi. So we can't just blame here Israel as the only country that's interested in striking Iran, because the fear of Iran's power is much even probably stronger in places like Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, and they really feel that fear. I mean, they buy all these weapons, Saudi Arabia and UAE and so on, but tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons just in the last few years because of their fear, not from Israel. These are not weapons about, oh, we might have a war with Israel. These are weapons that they're buying because they're afraid of having a war with Iran, and they're seeing it as an empire fight between them and the Iranians. So there is a lot of tension there, and I think it's important to keep that in context as we talk about that region. It's not always just a Christian, Jewish, Muslim. Just like among Christians in Northern Ireland, you had Catholics and Protestants, also among the Muslim groups there are divisions, like the Shia Sunnis, that can get very violent.
Right, unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions, so apologies. But thank you all for the questions that you posited, and this is an enriching experience for me, and I hope for all of you, so thank you for coming. And thank you to our speakers, both ones tonight. And we have parting gifts for both of our speakers. So thank you all for coming tonight, and I hope we see you next month for our next Pizza Perspectives. Have a good night.
You can hear much more about this if you join our classes to the Middle East that we run 3 or 4 every year. So just look at CRDC website.